While you may not know it, Rochester is an amazing place. In my presentation, I'll discuss two things about Rochester. The first is Mount Hope Cemetery. It is noteworthy that Mount Hope was the very first cemetery bought and maintained by a municipality in the entire United States. Also noteworthy is that during the 1960s and 1970s, Rochester's deaf community grew exponentially, experiencing a great influx of deaf people. Due to the establishment of the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, NTID. Many deaf students came to NTID to study, and after graduating settled in Rochester. In addition to NTID, Rochester was also the home of Kodak, the photography supplies and equipment giant. People came to Rochester and settled here. Many found employment at Kodak. Returning to Mount Hope Cemetery, we know that several deaf people are interred there. I have chosen one to tell you about, Cornelia Lathrop. I'd like to share the story of her life with you. Cornelia Lathrop was born in 1835, right here in Rochester. Her family, including grandparents, cousins, uncles, and aunts, all lived in Rochester. Cornelia's grandfather was the deacon of the Episcopal Church in Rochester. To the best of our knowledge, Cornelia was born deaf. Early on, her parents noticed that Cornelia's speech did not appear, and around the age of 1 or 2, they discovered that she was deaf. Her parents still provided a nurturing and spiritual home environment. Cornelia and her mother communicated with homemade gestures, which eventually became a unique home sign system, ensuring communication between mother and daughter. When Cornelia was still young, her curious parents learned of an event involving deaf students and attended. On the stage sat the principal of a deaf school, along with several deaf students and a blackboard. The principal would ask students questions which they would answer by signing or writing. In this way, the audience learned of ways to educate deaf children. Impressed, Cornelia's parents enrolled her in Fanwood, the deaf school in New York City, when she reached school age. In Cornelia's time, there was not yet a school for deaf children in Rochester. After Cornelia entered the deaf school in New York City, she progressed rapidly in learning to read, write, and sign. One of her teachers was Thomas Gallaudet. Interestingly, he was the son of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, who together with Laurent Clerc founded the first permanent deaf school in the United States. Growing up, Thomas Gallaudet acquired fluent sign language naturally by observing his father and deaf mother signing to each other. While at Vanwood, Cornelia kept a journal. She chronicled her life, her schooling, and her religious thoughts. In one entry, she described meeting none other than Thomas Gallaudet's deaf mother, Sophie Fowler Gallaudet, carefully documenting this noteworthy event. Also noted in Cornelia's journal is the death and funeral of Thomas Gallaudet's father, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. Her entries document a momentous and touching event in the deaf community. Cornelia's written English showed steady improvement over time. During Cornelia's schooling, her teacher, Thomas Gallaudet, was simultaneously studying for the priesthood. He hosted regular Bible study sessions for deaf people in the New York City area. Cornelia attended Vanwood for a 4-year period. During this time, her parents moved to be near her. Sadly, Cornelia became ill with a case of tuberculosis or TB. During Cornelia's illness, Gallaudet frequently visited her, praying with her, discussing God and religion, and giving her communion as her health declined. At one point, Gallaudet informed her that she would die, and Cornelia accepted this fate, showing her strong faith in God. In 1852, Cornelia died at the tender age of 16. Gallaudet made the trip from New York City to Rochester to attend Cornelia's burial in Mount Hope Cemetery. Gallaudet was much affected by Cornelia's memorial service, as well as by their shared prayers and long conversations about God and religion during her illness. Through her, he came to understand that fluent sign communication with deaf people was critical to their spiritual lives. The depth and clarity of their communication had given her a strong faith which comforted her at the end of her life. After seeing this, Thomas Gallaudet decided to establish a spiritual home for deaf people in New York City by founding the first deaf church in the United States. The name for this pioneering church was St. Anne's Church for the Deaf. One interesting anecdote: in U.S. deaf history, we often relate a folk tale about the father of Cornelia's teacher. It is said that Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet was inspired in his work by a chance meeting with a young deaf girl, Alice Cogswell. After seeing the benefits of learning for her, he went on to found the first permanent school for the deaf in the United States with Laurent Clerc. And so the inspiration stories of Gallaudet and his son are parallel. Like his father and Alice Cogswell, Thomas Gallaudet was inspired by meeting and ministering to Cornelia Lathrop. Through her, he grasped the fundamental importance of communication for learning about religion and God, and went on to establish the first church for deaf people in the U.S. That young girl, Cornelia Lathrop, is buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. If you know where Frederick Douglass is buried, Cornelia's gravesite is nearby. Her gravesite is situated up the road on the side of a hill. Her headstone is inscribed with her name Cornelia, along with that of George, her baby brother, and their last name Lathrop. Mount Hope Cemetery has a number of deaf people buried on its grounds. One was Cornelia Lathrop, who inspired the founding of the first deaf church in the USA. Isn't that fascinating?